Welcome back. This time we're talking about Person of Interest, Episode 2 of Season 5, SNAFU. Now this is a recap / review, so it's going to have spoilers for pretty much everything that's happened in this episode. So if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend hitting stop right now, go watch the episode, because this is another good episode to kick off what we now know is the final season of Person of Interest. Now if you're still here, I assume that you've already seen it, so let's jump in. The story basically follows what happened at the end of BSOD, last week's episode, in which Finch and company were able to finally restart the machine after it was living in a briefcase for a while. As we learn in this episode, it's been about 2 months since then, and they're still trying to work out all of the bugs and the kinks. During the initial test in this episode, the machine's facial recognition protocols go haywire, which results in a hilarious segment in which the machine starts mixing up who is who, and they represent this by allowing the actors to play their counterparts. And they have a lot of fun with this. They all mix it up. Everyone basically gets to play everybody else over the course of this few-minute scene. And it's really one of the funniest segments in the entire series. It actually reminds me of the episode If Then Else from last season, which also was from the point of view of the machine. If you told me at the beginning of the show that the two funniest moments of this entire series would be from the point of view of the machine, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But it goes to show just how far this show has evolved since then. But anyway, so we have this happen, and it is very funny, as I said. One of the kind of more dramatic moments is when we hear John, or at least the other actors playing John, talking about how all these people keep dying because they're not getting numbers, and it really kind of goes to the core of what his character has been lately. That's his now purpose, and the idea of purpose will come back, to mirror it at the end of this episode. But anyway, they have this test. It fails, which leads them to decide they really need more processing power. That kind of drives the action for the first maybe act of this episode, especially with John and Finch having to go out on this mission to steal some server blades. And we also find out that Root is essentially trapped in the subway station because without the machine giving her new identities, she is at complete risk of being caught by Samaritan. So she's basically been trapped here for the last 2 months and is getting a little stir crazy. And later on, we kind of see how she starts nesting, and it's a nice development for her character, I do have to say. So anyway, they do this mission to steal the server blades, which results in some additional comic relief. It's kind of nice to have this comedy going on, especially after 2 pretty dramatic episodes with this season's premiere and last season's finale. So with the server blades in hand, we find out that Finch has sort of modified the subway car, and it's now mobile. And that could be very important because at the beginning of last week's episode, we saw the subway station with the car gone, and that looked very ominous. And that whole scene was supposed to be as ominous as possible. But now we know that the machine could have moved, and it doesn't mean that everyone's dead and we lost. So that was an interesting development. This also leads to an interesting conversation between Finch and Root over what's more important, the numbers or stopping Samaritan. And I can see how this could eventually lead to some friction between these two characters through the course of the season. But that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. Some other interesting things we learn in this at this point in the episode is that John and Fosco are don't have a whole lot to do because murders are down. It's heavily implied that this has to do with Samaritan. As we find out later in the episode, apparently suicides are up. So, again, heavily implied that Samaritan is somehow involved. But then again, at this point in the series, pretty much anything that's bad or unusual is going to get blamed on Samaritan until we find otherwise, as we learn again later on in this episode. And as an aside, we do find out that John is apparently still dating Dr. Campbell, but we haven't actually seen her yet and seen what he's actually told her. Well, with the new servers in place, it's time to once again test the machine. which they do with a quick surveillance mission to hunt down John, which it does very easily. Though Finch does get a little nervous when they ask for some more information about John, and it lists pretty much all of the bad things he's done over the course of this series and before. What's interesting is the machine is essentially now a completely open system like Samaritan, giving John and Root and anyone else with access to the machine total access to all of the information that has up until now always been behind a firewall, protecting that information from its human handlers. And that's another thing that's going to be interesting to see how this plays out between Finch and Root as the season moves on. Even though Finch has some misgivings, he goes ahead and starts the numbers protocol, and promptly they get something like 30 numbers. But as John and Fosco go to investigate these numbers, they quickly realize something is very wrong. The machine obviously has no context to the information it's receiving. It flags a fake bomb threat that a kid called in to get out of taking a test. It flags an actor on stage who kills another character. And even more troubling is that it seems to be completely out of time, in that it's flagging things that happened decades before. So at this point, Finch and Root realize that it's lacking a level of context to apply to the information it's reading, which ultimately leads Finch to make a horrible mistake in that he decides to have the machine look at the context of themselves, namely Finch, Root, and John. And it promptly looks at all of the death and destructions that they have caused over the course of this series. And without the additional context of why all that was happening, ultimately decides that they are all threats. This also leads us to one of our first flashbacks of the episode, going back once again to Finch training the machine. In this case, training it to differentiate good people and bad people. And the definitions that he uses are very black and white. With Finch and Root trying to figure out what's wrong with the machine, because at this point they don't realize that the machine has labeled them threats, the numbers keep coming. Namely two. One, a woman named Lori from Tulsa, and a chronic gambler named Joe. John takes the girl while Fosco is left to investigate the gambler. But just before John can start his investigation, the woman shows up at the precinct, which is just a little odd. It's not too much later that Finch and Root finally realize that they've been labeled threats and that the problem that they're dealing with is much bigger than they thought. So they ask John to come back to the subway station. He's followed by the seemingly innocent woman Lori, who turns out to be a hired hitman. And gunfire ensues. Now I have to say, the machine looking at our heroes as bad guys is sort of a trope. I've seen it in a number of series where you have a character suffer from amnesia and only see the bad in our good characters because they don't have the context of what was going on in those situations. Unfortunately, this doesn't last too long, but it's worth pointing out that it is sort of a recognizable trope. As Finch tries to reason with the machine, he's shown footage of his previous teachings and realizes, how different he is back when he was talking about black and white, which, considering this was shortly after 9/11, is not surprising, but it does show how much he's grown to this point in the series, that he realizes how naive he was at the time. He also realizes that the machine's sense of time is completely out of whack and is basically experiencing its entire lifespan simultaneously, including all the times that Finch was forced to essentially kill it. This leads to yet another great performance by Michael Emerson as Finch, as he's telling the machine how he can't promise that they'll always do the right thing, but they'll always try to do their best. And then ultimately the machine comes to realize that our good guys are really the good guys. And I have to mention that the music in this show is always great. Not just the songs they use, but the actual background music. And this scene is just one of those times where I just really noticed it, how it was building and building and building, and then the machine switches the indicator over Finch from threat to back to admin, and the music just stops. And it's just it's such a powerful moment. While all of this is going on, we have John still fighting against the hitman, and Fosco investigating this gambler, and it turns out that it's a good thing he was there, because one of the numbers actually turned out to be right, in that these gangsters went to his house to kill him and possibly his family, and Fosco's there to save the day. And I do have to say, it's a little funny that it appears that Fosco has learned kneecapping lessons from John, because he hits everyone's kneecap pretty cleanly. And as we find out later in the episode, he ends up getting some well-deserved recognition for his heroism in this. And it's good to see Fosco get his due every once in a while. I hope this isn't setting him up for something terrible to happen later on. Meanwhile, John is able to take out the hitman, and ultimately leads us to our kind of crescendo moment where all of our heroes gather in the in Central Park to have a picnic. And it could come off as terribly goofy, but it actually feels very well deserved after all of the craziness that they've had to deal with over the last few episodes. Ruth's able to finally get out of the subway station. She has her identities back. Fosco is having a good time. John's having a good time, and apparently joining the bowling league. And it was just a nice moment. It was just nice to see our characters having a fun time for a change. But of course, the episode couldn't end on a truly happy note. And we get the final scene where we discover that one of the previous numbers that was thought to have been a red herring, or just the machine messing up, a guy named Jeff Blackwell, who is sent to this office building and essentially, unbeknownst to him, becomes Samaritan's latest agent. And if you looked at the information that popped up, I thought there was a couple things that were interesting. Obviously, the flashing propensity for violence came up, but I also thought it was interesting to note the guy has an IQ of 153. I mean, that's genius level right there. So between that and how they kind of built up the conversation with this recruiter person talking about purpose, which goes back, as I said earlier, to John's kind of purpose of with the numbers. I would be very surprised if we don't see Mr. Blackwell again soon. So, as a whole, this episode was a great continuation of the action that we got in the first episode, with all of the difficulties of shrinking down the machine to the suitcase and then trying to save it before the batteries died in the last episode. It really felt like a cop-out if they were suddenly able to get the machine working right away with no problems. So this was a good episode to make them work to get back to at least somewhat of a status quo. That we didn't have a quick one-episode reset to back to what we're always used to. Especially with this being the last season, a total reset would have just felt off, and frankly unearned at this point. I touched on a few of these during the course of the recap, but I want to kind of talk about it again. Some of the arcs that seem to be building for this episode, character-wise, we have John and his trying to be more open with people, with his dating the doctor and all of that, but then this potential tension I see growing between Root and Finch on two fronts. One being, which is more important, the numbers or the battle against Samaritan? And then the whole thing with the machine now being an open system. At first, Finch was very adamant that they were going to close that firewall back as soon as they got the bugs worked out. While Root's very clear that she believes that it would be stupid to do that, and not have access to that information when they're in the middle of a war. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out, especially since Finch does change his mind and decide to keep the machine completely open. And it was not really clear at this point whether he is truly agreeing with Root, or if it's because he had the opportunity to see his love, Grace, and whether he doesn't want to lose that option. So it'll be interesting to see if he continues to utilize the open system to keep an eye on Grace. So I think I rattled on enough for this episode. I do want to know what you think. Let me know if you agree with my assessment or not. Leave me a comment. As always, you can subscribe to my channel. Check out my other TV and movie reviews. Until next episode, watch out for Samaritan.